banks that are not regulated by New York State. What do you see happening with mortgages in that regard? And are people who cannot pay now going to be able to just add it on to the end of their mortgage whenever that happens to be?
Well, so the issue here is broken into three parts. Those with a state chartered mortgage, and we've got legislation that's going to basically try to give the ability of people to push that to the end of their mortgage. Similarly, you have the federal forbearance bill. There are discussions going on with Congress, and hopefully, as it relates to the federally chartered banks, we can get some relief there. Very, very few of the people, and I haven't met anybody in my district that uses a state chartered bank for residential mortgage. So there really isn't the help there. That is going to be part of the package as well. However, that's why I'm putting the focus on, if we're going to have a voucher program that is going to give money to economically distressed taxpayers to pay their rent, we've got to at least have it for economically distressed property owners to pay their property taxes. One of the other issues, of course, is that if you using government, and this is unprecedented, but if you're using government funds to basically give to people to pay their rent, in effect, that is a grant, you're doing the same to give people to pay their mortgage, then an argument can be made that, well, but the person who's getting the money for the mortgage is actually getting more value because it is going towards their equity. That's why I think it's easier to discuss this in terms of property taxes, and then try to, on a forbearance basis, figure out what we can, what can be done going forward. We're also looking very carefully at what Congress is going to do and what proposed legislation is, because it may be that they pass something with their own rules and restrictions and qualifications, and then we would have to work towards, implementing that. And quite frankly, unrestricted money that we get, the first dollars are going to have to go so that we can get more money, to local governments, to schools, to cover the healthcare costs, so that we don't have, police, firefighters, and teachers laid off, and have huge property tax increases all of a sudden, whether it's this year or next year. If we don't fix this problem this year, you're going to see huge property tax proposals coming in next year at all levels of government. And that's
going to be an interesting context, because if that happens next year, how many municipalities, local governments, and school districts are going to want to pierce the cap, the 2% cap? And is the legislature going to eliminate the cap on a one-time basis so they can do so without having to get a 60% majority? Do you think that's part of the context here?
The couple of people discussing that, but there really hasn't been a major discussion. And of course, as you know, it just really relates to the school districts, because if they have to go to the voters. If town boards, county legislatures want to pierce a cap, well, then the elected officials have the authority to do that.
You had said before, right? You had said before that you thought commercial rent issues or mortgage issues would be discussed separately from the residential piece?
Yeah, the determination was made there wasn't enough time to figure that out. So, that is something that, we're looking to discuss subsequently. Again, I think we have to see more in terms of what we're going to get from the federal government. If we don't get anything from the federal government, I think we have to look at, and this is me speaking, some of the issues that we have been discussing, Mitch, and that is are there some ways that we can encourage local governments, whether it is with some sort of zoning incentives or tax breaks towards some redevelopment, because I think one of the issues that we're going to have here, and you folks are more the experts are the experts. I'm not, but in talking to some folks, you're going to see a lot of retail, particularly some of the larger retail chains, are going to go out of business. You already see a lot of, mom and pops are gone, and people, landlords have the for rent signs up. So I think we're going to have to look, particularly as it relates to the retail issue, redevelopment of some properties to some extent for other purposes. I've also heard, which I know probably is not something everyone on call wants to hear, but it's probably reality, that now that we're doing a lot of things remotely, they're going to, in the commercial office space, maybe a lot of people saying they don't need as much space as they had before for their employees, and they could, operate some of it more remotely. So I think these are going to be challenges that we're going to be facing economically. And that's why I think the state government has got to come up with some ways that we can direct what economic development funds and we may have, probably more what sort of economic tax breaks can we give. Hopefully we'll have a real infrastructure program at some point, so that we can then pump in, including federal money, so we can pump in money to some of the infrastructure costs that could help the development. Not just talking roads and bridges, but I'm talking expansion of a new sewage treatment issues. And then I think also we need to come up with ways that perhaps we can incentivize local governments to allow for some changes of use, whether that's going from totally commercial to maybe a mixed use on a piece of property to deal with the new economic realities we may be facing when we come out of this.
I had a question about the eviction issue that we had discussed before. Do you assume that's going to end at some point, especially relating to people who were in the eviction protocol before the first executive order that were not COVID-19 related, and now the eviction has stayed because of the executive orders? Do you see any opportunity to go backwards?
Yeah, I mean, that's the governor's office. A lot of that is going through there. So it's hard for me to understand, to speak for his office and what's going to happen. I mean, there does seem to be a concept that, at least I believe at some point we've got to get back to, some sort of a normal business. I would love to have, maybe after this call, any thoughts that folks might have in terms of arrears, especially as we're dealing with, whether we do or do not get any significant money from the federal government to help to deal with this. Because I know a lot of people have already been on the phone, whether it's commercial and residential, talking to their tenants and saying, what's your situations? Where are you? And trying to work out some sort of arrangements and, prepayment plans. We're even looking at maybe the idea that maybe there's a way government can encourage with some incentives, both for landlords and for tenants, some sort of economic incentives to encourage payment plans, and again, based on real hardships. I mean, I gotten some calls from, I got a call from somebody who was sold their house and been renting another house for $5,000 a month, and has all the money sitting in the bank, and said to me, well, why are you not on that rent bill? So I don't have to pay rent. It's going to save me $15,000. And I said, well, do you have the money from your house sitting in a bank account somewhere? I was told, yeah. So, we've got to define who's economically,
right,
where the economic hardships are. And I know most, people who own property, whether it's commercial or residential, they just want a good tenant, and they want to figure out a way to move on, and is not looking to bleed people for money they don't have. But probably going to be also a lot of people that I think are going to move. There are going to be a lot of retail businesses that aren't going to be there anymore, and probably on the residential end, many people may be relocating simply because they won't have a job here in the region.
Well, we're doing, as you know, we did a survey of our members in April with regard to rent payments, both in the commercial, but mainly in the residential community. We did it with ABLI. We just sent it out to everybody for their review and to do the May one, because we want to see what the differences are. So if you haven't done that yet, please make sure you fill that out for us, and we will provide the senator and the other members of the delegation that information so you can use it as the conversations go forward in that regard. Is there anyone else who has any questions that they did not send to me that they would like to have asked? Because I know the senator has to get back to the majority conference. Okay. Senator, we thank you very much for your time
Thank you so much, Mitch, and
information. We will
everybody.
keep the lines of communication open. Does anybody else have a question?
Can I ask?
Stephen, go ahead.
I think that the least expensive and most helpful thing the state could do is define what the governor meant by impacted by COVID or economically impacted by COVID
Right.
when he ended that order. Because we don't know what that means. And so we don't know, we've got tenants who are taking advantage of the situation, and we have tenants who are really in trouble. And our approach is, if a tenant's really in trouble, we're going to work with them. If they're just looking to take advantage of the situation, we don't want to work with them. And just by defining that more clearly, I think that will go a long way towards easing the problems as we come out of this. I think that's,
Yep.
and that costs no money to do.
Yeah, no, we absolutely have to define it legally, and unfortunately, probably you also have to have an agency, maybe like the state tax department, who will implement it, because you can't define everybody's situation. But I agree, that's a mess the way it's just sort of left open.
Yeah, just to build on what Steve's saying, because I brought up the question from earlier. We have many people that didn't pay rent back to January, even December 2019. We were in the middle of legal process evicting them, and pandemic hits and everything's put on stay. For them to argue that they've been impacted by COVID is really not a fair argument in any way whatsoever. They're going to wind up living in the unit for over a year rent-free.
We have, the group is looking at that very specifically, and we're talking about COVID-related economic hardship. So anything that was owed prior to the to the beginning of the executive order that the governor signed declaring the emergency, would not be an economic hardship situation.
Right.
Good.
Thanks.
Jim, did you have a question, Jimmy Conlon?
Yeah, I do. First of all, thank you, Senator, again for taking the time with us. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate that you've identified, an allegiance to the voucher versus the forgiveness of the 3 months completely. And obviously, you're taking a public good and transposing that onto a private sector industry and saying, you guys pay for this, even though we all think it's a public good that needs to be done. So thank you for your support of that. But in my not-for-profit world, I've been the chair of the CDC for a long time, and we manage almost 7,000 vouchers on Long Island, and just point of fact, we do have a voucher home ownership program where the vouchers can pay mortgages and do pay mortgages. So if you guys are considering that,
offline, get some details about that so I can give it to my legislative counsel, because that's we're kind of looking at that. That if you wouldn't mind, that would be great.
Would you mind if I ask Gwen O'Shea to give you a call and walk you through or send you whatever she thinks? I'll have her do that. And then in addition, though, just watching that would be great. But I also see, just in being involved in that I mean, the monster of administration that goes on to get the capital from HUD to DHCR to local administrators and then out to the people, and taking that concept and creating a whole new expanded voucher program. I applaud you guys for thinking about it, but I wonder if you think it's realistic to come up with something like that.
It's the challenge, and we've got to look at that. And again, we have to see how Congress does it. And if, how they're going to do it. They'll probably have some guidelines and restrictions, and we're going to try to keep it simple, which probably means it's going to be, clearly unemployed, lost the business, something that's quick and easy to prove, rather than trying to look at everybody's overall economic conditions, because then you get into areas of how many people in the household, are your kids home, or they can et cetera. It's harder to figure out.
Good. Anybody else have
Well,
anything?
thank you for trying.
Well, good. Senator, thank you again very much for your time.
Everybody.
Thank you for your support of
so
our
much.
issues. And I will follow up with you on some of the questions we still have outstanding, and we will go from there.
You got it. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Take care.
Take care.